What's up, everyone? We're back for another week of Locked On Bucks, and it was a strange weekend for Milwaukee. We had so much fun last week, beating the Sixers, beating the Nets, Giannis creating history, and then they gave up 153 to the Clippers, and then lost to Dallas and Jason Kidd. And by the way, Dallas has been a bit of a bogey team for the Bucks over the last few years. There's no doubt about that. So we're going to get into this Dallas game, and of course, we're going to get into where the standings are at because they have changed again, but there's only a couple of games left until the postseason, so we're starting to look ahead to that, including a couple of big games against Eastern Conference teams this week. So let's get started.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Bucks. I'm your host, Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on the show daily and also from my work over at ESPN. And joining me, as he so often does on a Sunday evening from the Bucks Radio Network, Justin Garcia. For today's episode that is brought to you by BetOnline. We'll talk about BetOnline a little bit more later on, but BetOnline has you covered this season with props, odds, and lines, and more than ever before. That's BetOnline where the game starts. And of course, we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of every day. And by the way, the numbers just came in. So last week, 46% up from the week before. Now, of course, Giannis had a really big week. I think also we're getting close to the postseason, so people are starting to get a little bit excited here. But we really appreciate everyone listening and watching along the way. And, of course, subscribe wherever you catch us, but definitely on YouTube. We're seeing those numbers start to go up as well, which is cool for us because it's still a relatively new thing, Justin. But couple losses on the weekend. It was a little bit of a weird one. The Clippers game in particular, the Robert Covington 43-point game, 11 3-point makes game. That one was kind of a throwaway. I think this Dallas game, people will read into it a little bit more, and they were in this game for a long part of it. But the afternoon, nobody likes the afternoon games. Giannis hates it. He mentioned again that he didn't get his sleep. The game was on at 3 a.m. on Monday morning for me. So I felt like I was in Europe with our Greek friends who normally watch games at all hours of the night. So I don't like it either. So I like nothing about what went on today at 5-4.
I think I think this is the first loss they've had this season in that time slot too, which is a rarity. That I know by the numbers they've been really bad. And we kind of had it was a talking point off the air too, where Dave Kane was like, well, they beat the Knicks at that time slot. They beat the Suns in a 2:30 game, and the Celtics was the same thing. But yeah, we had to say like, well, yeah, this year, I mean, if you go back through the years, this team has really struggled with those. And Giannis especially struggled. He still got to, I think, 28 points, but he didn't look good. And there was a stretch, and it might have actually closed the game, where he didn't have a field goal from the end of the third quarter, near the end, all the way until the final 2 minutes of the fourth. He went without a field goal, and he was just getting to the free throw line. Even then, it wasn't a high volume. So this was not a good game from Giannis. It was another subpar game from Khris Middleton as well. And, you know, when you looked around the floor, they just didn't really have anybody that you would look to and say, well, they played a pretty good game. And you know, it's kind of a trend that we've seen from the last week. And the way you set things up too, of last week was a good week for the Bucks, and then you got to the weekend. It's true, but also, you know, that Nets game, it's, I guess, one of the reasons why, look, I still would rather not have to worry about Kevin Durant in a first round series and set that up of your path. But I do think it's not like the Miami Heat last year, but I do think people are getting a little too concerned over a team that clearly has flaws, because the Bucks, they won the game and they were great in the fourth quarter. They did not play anywhere near good in that game against the Brooklyn Nets, and it was still down to the wire there. So they didn't play good against the Nets. They did not play good today. They didn't play at all on Friday against the Clippers. So coming up here, we're kind of talking off the air. I think you only have 2 games left that you're really going to take seriously, and that's your next 2 games this week: Thursday in Chicago, or Tuesday in Chicago, and Thursday against the Celtics, which that Celtics game is probably going to decide who gets second in the Eastern Conference. So you got to play well in those games just to get something going in the playoffs, because we've talked about the importance of, you want your defense, you know, playing well and getting things turned around and play your best basketball moving into the playoffs, that extends to your best players as well. So in those games, you want to see Khris Middleton snap back. And this is the trend that you've seen the memes and the jokes on Twitter of here's the cycle of Khris Middleton. Like, it's nothing new. He has games like this. And then, 2-3 games later, he bounces back to the guy that looks like the all-star. So I expect him to get back there at some point this week. But the big takeaway for me is just, man, even Giannis today wasn't good. And no one has really played all that well outside of Giannis for the last week.
It will be interesting this week. And Giannis said post-game he's going to head to Chicago tomorrow. He's going to eat some deep dish pizza with his kids and then hopefully play some good basketball the day after in Chicago. So, look, I personally have felt that there's been a little bit of a different feel, and this can go back a couple of weeks, and the Bucks have had a really hard schedule. They've played a bunch of good teams, but maybe it's just me, and maybe I'm looking into this more than what other people would, because Dallas obviously are a really good team. They've got virtually the same record as the Bucks. I believe they're 49-30. The Bucks are 48-30.
Now they're better. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think sometimes we look at the standings, or we may overlook a team like Dallas because they're in the West. We don't watch them as much, but they're a good team and they're a good defensive team. And the Bucks certainly did struggle today. But for the Bucks defense, so Luka Doncic, and let's be honest, he's been a player that's given the Bucks real problems over the last few years, and it's not a problem that's
it's not exclusive to the Bucks.
That's right. This guy gives everyone problems. But he had 32 points, and the 15 assists is what stands out, because we've seen certain players around the league against this Bucks defense where you're like, okay, they can score, that's fine. But when you're just carving up the defense like he was from a passing point of view, that's where it becomes really difficult. And there was certainly some frustration with the Bucks defense. Again, I'm not going to, to me, after watching this team, what they did in the postseason last year, even watching what they've done in certain games this year against certain opponents, I don't particularly have the same level of concern or any stress about Bud and making adjustments in game, because we've seen him do it. That was the one thing a year ago that you could have had a criticism for sure, and it would have been legitimate. But now we've seen it. Now, I'm not saying that the Bucks didn't want to win this game, because they clearly did. Giannis played 40 minutes, which tells you that they wanted to win this game against a good team. But Luka was certainly causing them problems, particularly in pick and roll scenarios, and that's where he can either score, he can go to the step back, he can facilitate. But what did you see defensively? Because there was some frustration on the Twitter sphere after this game.
Yeah, I mean, well, you noticed it early, and I think you kind of assumed it coming in as well, that this isn't going to be a Brook game. The Mavs were targeting him in the first half and trying to get him in the pick and roll, and it was just a disaster when it happened. And we saw that last year, depending on the matchup as well. But to Bud's credit, it was really early into the game. We had the conversation off the air on the broadcast of, you could kind of see within those first couple of possessions, the Bucks went on a 9-0 run, and it was 11-2. And then the Mavs went on a similar run, and it was tied at 13, I think, early on. But then after that, you started to see some things stand out. And that was Luka Doncic was just targeting Brook Lopez, getting him in that pick and roll and taking advantage of it. And you just looked at the last few box scores, and you're like, we kind of saw this against Brooklyn too. This feels like it's going to be like another 19 or 20-minute game from Brook, and I think that's what he finished at. So Bud made the adjustment there, and that, okay, I can't keep him on the floor that much longer, and I pretty much have to pull him off at some of these moments and put him out there exclusively in the minutes that Luka Doncic was off the floor. So you saw a lot of Brook in that second quarter and a little bit in the third quarter as well. But with Bobby Portis, he's obviously better in the switch, but Luka Doncic was able to do the same thing to him as well. What did stand out to me most was the Bucks we've seen this a couple of times this season, but they were just over-helping way too much aggressively on defense, where a couple of the possessions too, where when Giannis was defending Luka Doncic and he'd get in the lane, and Giannis is in a pretty good position on Luka, and you're still having the help defenders come over. And you mentioned the number of assists that Luka had. It was because the Bucks were just over helping, and Luka had guys that were wide open, and Dallas started to heat up. So, you look at things like that. I think it was pretty clear watching it too that, with Dallas, with the lineup that they had today, with no Maxi Kleba, Dwight Powell was basically the only big that they played. Marquise Chris got in there for a couple of minutes, but that was it. You have to play small against this lineup. And, if this was a playoff game, I would expect Bud is not going to play this and approach it the way that he did today, that you would start to see some adjustments. And if it's a playoff series, you would see the adjustments on, okay, we got killed over helping. Let's do this and let's not do this, just as they did against the Phoenix Suns last year in the finals. So I'm with you in that. Let's not read too much into this. Yes, they wanted to win, but this was not a playoff series. And it wasn't anything where, we got to figure this out, because the Bucks have figured most of this out. And I think that's what last year was really for. You would like to have some more consistency and at least be flashing a defense that, looks like its old self going into the playoffs. We've seen flashes of it, but we still haven't seen it consistently outside of fourth quarter moments against the Sixers and against the Brooklyn Nets. Because if you look at the last month, as successful as they've been, the defense has still been pretty mediocre. So I think that's the one thing you would point to. But this, it's a Western Conference game. So as of right now, conference games are what's more important to you, and the two games Tuesday and Thursday are the really important ones against the Bulls and against the Celtics. Not that this was a game the Bucks didn't care about, but this wasn't on that scale. And so I think it was just a number of things. They did not shoot the ball very well. You had a lot of poor performances from offensive players you needed it from. I mean, Brook Lopez did not look very good offensively either, and that's kind of been a trend lately as well, that he's just settling for some really bad and tough shots. So that's another thing you'd like to see improve. But this was just across the board, not great performance. And, again, if this is a playoff series, I think things look differently, and I think you do see those adjustments. So I'm not overly concerned by that.
More on Giannis and Khris in a little bit, but if you have anything that you need to do earlier in the day, like potentially play an NBA game of basketball, for me, get up and watch a game of basketball, the way that you can get yourself fired up is with a Built Bar. We know that. The best tasting protein bar that's ever been made. And look, we're into April now. So if you had New Year's resolutions, I would say a high percentage of people have already given up on them. But if your resolution was dietary and you wanted to stick to your resolution to eat right, you can do that with Built Bar, because it feels like it's not really a resolution, because you will actually enjoy eating them as well. They're low calorie and high protein. You can replace your candy bars with these because they're just better. A typical candy bar can be anywhere from 200 to 300 calories, but you're looking at 130 with a Built Bar. With most of the Built Bars there. And the flavors, we've got mint brownie, coconut almond, the white chocolate cookies and cream as well. So they're always coming up with new flavors. Just go to built.com and you'll be able to see all the new flavors they've got monthly, weekly. They've got specials, so you can go and check it all out. Just go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Also, check out the Locked On Now podcast. You'll see little recaps. Sometimes I put them on Twitter. You'll see the little recap videos that I do, and that's basically makes up the Locked On Now podcast, so you can go around the league and find out what happened the night before. Just with Khris Middleton, and, clearly he did have his struggles tonight or this afternoon, as you pointed to, and I saw a few tweets, and this is always the case. Khris Middleton, no matter what he's done, he has a few bad games, and the criticism will come. He was 3 for 14 in this game here today against Dallas. But I did notice something, and I think it was during the third quarter, or it might have been the second quarter, he was fouled. It was an and one situation. He sort of landed on the ground, and he was grabbing his wrist, shaking out his wrist after that play. It was just very subtle. It happened very quickly. But we know that he has missed a couple of games recently with wrist soreness, and I think we all kind of look at that and sort of raise our eyebrow and say, okay, is this real? Is this just getting some late season maintenance? How much of an issue is this really? Now, I believe it's his left wrist, so it's not his shooting hand. And I'm not saying that this is any reason or excuse for why he didn't play well today. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. But it was just interesting to see that visual because, again, we don't know a lot about this injury, but I don't know where it happened or how it happened or how long he's been dealing with it. But that's probably the first piece of evidence I've seen to suggest that he actually has got some kind of issue there.
Yeah, I noticed that on the replay as well. And, with Khris, it was really the struggles were mostly contained to the fourth quarter, and that's where the team just couldn't get anything going. They had a couple of stretches in this game where it was just turnovers that kind of plagued them. The Mavs had some similar stretches as well, but Khris Middleton, we mentioned the numbers, and by the numbers, it wasn't a great game, but it took him a while to kind of get going. And in the first half, I think he took 5 shots, but it was the fourth quarter that built up a lot of those issues for him, where he was just 1 of 7, 0 of 2 on his threes. He did get to the free throw line 3 times, so scored 4 points there, but he took 7 shots to get there. Take that out of the mix, and he was 2 of 7 going into the fourth, which still isn't great, but it was the fourth quarter where a lot of those issues came. But with Khris, I will say, and this has kind of been the theme with him as well, is even on the nights where it's just not falling and he's not having a good offensive performance, and we've seen it recently a couple of times, he's still invested in the game, and he's still making an impact elsewhere, where, today he had 9 assists, and I think he only had 2 or 3 turnovers. But he's still getting his numbers elsewhere, where he's getting his teammates involved and still, involved in the game plan that way. It's just, we've seen enough of him to know it just takes, with Drew Holiday too, it just typically takes 1 or 2 shots for him to find that spot and see the shot fall and get into his rhythm. And it just couldn't happen. And I think the frustrating part was he had some pretty good matchups in this game. Like if you go back to Brooklyn, where he had some struggles, we've seen that before, where Bruce Brown is a really, really bad matchup for Khris Middleton. We saw it at times in the playoff series, and we saw it in the regular season last year too. But Bruce Brown is pretty similar size to him. He's a really good individual defender, obviously, and he's got long reach. So he just makes it's a tough matchup. But today, he was able to really target and get those matchups. He was able to get on Jalen Brunson quite a bit in this game, and a few times as well on Spencer Dinwiddie, but he would get good looks and they wouldn't fall. And to me, that was kind of the story for this team is, I mentioned you didn't have a great game across the board. I guess the one area where that may be inaccurate is I thought the shot quality the Bucks got in this game was actually pretty good. It's a lot of those shots are looks that you want to get, and they didn't fall. I think if you were going to question the quality of some of the shots in this game, it would probably be some of the shots that Brook Lopez took. But Khris was able to get those matchups we talked about. Giannis, again, and we saw this the other day as well, just inexplicably was missing some shots near and at the rim, which, it seems like it never happens, but there were a few again today. So I felt like the Bucks were getting good quality shots. It was just they weren't falling. And, when that happens and when your defense is overhelping and letting Luka Doncic get his teammates involved the way he did, it spells disaster. And I do think, too, we pointed out on the pregame show, the Mavs have obviously been one of the best teams in the league for the last couple of months. And really the Mavs and Celtics have been the best teams in the league since, January 1st. But the Bucks and the Mavs in the last month have maybe been the 2 best teams in the league, where in March, the Bucks were 11-3, the Mavs were 12-4. And they were a combined 14-0 in games where you got to the clutch situations. Bucks went 8-0. The Mavs went 6-0. And the Mavs have been one of the best teams in that spot. And I think watching the game today, you see why. If you don't watch a lot of Dallas Mavericks basketball, because Luka Doncic, as you pointed out, he's not just for the Bucks. He's a tough matchup for all teams. And, the frustrating part was Luka hit 3 threes. But 2 of them were step backs over Giannis, where he perfectly contested the shot. One was over Bobby Portis, where he was in a pretty good spot as well. So the toughest threes he took were the 3 that he made. But Luka's ability to hit those shots and score, but how he gets his teammates involved, that is why the Mavs are so good in these clutch situations, because Luka can take over and it's tough to defend there. But he creates such high quality shots for his teammates that, even if you don't have a traditional number 2 type star, Luka creates the shots that, make that player look like a star.
Yeah, the Mavericks have been playing really well since they traded Porzingis as well. And obviously Spencer Dinwiddie's played some good basketball, but they leaned into the small ball stuff. It seems to be working for them. The other stat that hurt the Bucks tonight, they were -9 in free throw attempts. And it's interesting when you look at the threes, the Bucks shot the ball really well early in the game from the three-point line. But really, anyone not named Giannis, Khris, or Wesley Matthews, they shot the ball really well. But Giannis was 0 for 3 from 3, Khris Middleton 0 for 4, Wesley Matthews 0 for 3, who, by the way, Wesley Matthews -27 in his 17 minutes. Didn't go well when he was on the floor today. And interestingly enough, as you mentioned, Bobby Portis, they were +11 in his 22 minutes there, as they sort of did go small there. So some of those numbers are interesting. I do want to bring up the foul on Giannis. Now, there was actually a pool report with the officials after the game, which surprised me a little bit. But I want to get to that after I talk about our friends at betonline.net, which is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championship odds, podcasts, and reviews for all sorts of different leagues around the world as well. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. You can find where Giannis sits in the MVP battle with the odds there. You can find where the Bucks sit in the championship. Maybe you want to double those up. The Bucks for the title, Giannis for MVP, Giannis for Defensive Player of the Year. You can find all the odds related to the Milwaukee Bucks at betonline.net. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. So this foul came with 5:06 left in the third quarter. There was a turnover, skip ahead pass to Giannis. He's got Reggie Bullock there, and what's he really going to do? There's nothing he can do. He knew that, so he sort of just wrapped up Giannis, and quite honestly, I mean, he did it relatively safely, I would say. There was no high contact. It didn't look like there was any real, potential for injury, which is ultimately why it wasn't a flagrant or anything like that. I was just surprised that they went to a pool report. So sometimes if there's a controversial play, a controversial call, a reporter will be able to ask the officials for an explanation on why the play occurred the way it did. So they did this for this play, which is interesting. And that was basically the feedback they got. No high contact, no unnecessary contact. My question would be, and this goes back to last week where Khris Middleton got ejected in Brooklyn. And I was at the time a little surprised that Khris Middleton got ejected. But at the same time, I don't really have a major problem if they want to stamp out those types of fouls. Like, do I think that Khris Middleton was trying to hurt Bruce Brown? Of course he wasn't. That's not who Khris Middleton is. But I'm fine if they want to continue to throw people out for these fouls, because really in that situation, yes, you want to go for the block, but it was unlikely he was going to be able to do that. You don't want someone getting hurt. Well, but with the Giannis one, my only point that I would make here, and we see this in the NBL in Australia, that's an unsportsmanlike foul, which is 2 free throws and the ball. So it doesn't have to be dangerous, but again, it's the intentional foul.
He didn't make a play on the ball.
He didn't make a play on the ball. So my point of view is that it falls in that category, and I wish that would come in to the league.
Well, and I was a little surprised because, I mean, it was flagrant that he didn't make a play on the ball.
Yes.
Like, it was blatant there. So I was surprised there wasn't even a hesitation to, like, let's review this and make sure. Like, I thought they were going to go to the monitors and we would be told, like, oh, it's under review for a flagrant, and they would ultimately come back and say no, because there was no intent behind it, and he wrapped him up and he wasn't airborne. So, those are the areas you would look to and say, well, yeah, it was. I guess if you're a Bucks fan, you can question why isn't this a flagrant, but he wasn't airborne. And I think that was the big thing, but he didn't make a play on the ball. And, when these rules first started to change, that was one of the big things put in play of, you got to make a play for the ball. You got to make a basketball play. So that's what surprised me, was you're not even going to, like, review this. Like, you're not going to go to the monitor, even if it's ultimately ruled, hey, there was no malicious intent and we thought he wrapped him up and didn't put him in harm, so it's fine. But there was no play in the ball. And I think that's what really stood out to me and to everybody that was in the broadcast booth today as well, that we all kind of commented on that. And the Middleton play too, I'm the exact same as you, that I don't have a problem with it being called a flagrant two. I saw a lot of outrage. I would have called it a flagrant one, but if the goal is let's eliminate these plays, then fine. Like, this is the way you do it. And I know people say, well, that's the most exciting or one of the most exciting plays in basketball. And it is. But there's maybe 5 guys that make that play exciting. Like, Khris Middleton is not one of those guys. Ultimately, the upside, it's not there. Khris Middleton is not going to block Bruce Brown. I just didn't see what the gain was from it. And he doesn't make that contention if Bruce Brown doesn't slow up, and it just goes in all the way. So if you're trying to remove those plays, fine. And to worry over, well, these are exciting plays, the chase down blocks. Sure, they are. When LeBron does it, when Giannis does it, when Rudy Gobert does it, Karl Anthony Towns, players like that. But it's not wing players for the most part doing it. So that's the way you get rid of that play.
Yeah, I mean, I could bang on about it all the time that I think the unsportsmanlike foul for any type of take foul is what you want to bring in, including when the Bucks do it. And by the way, I will say I will use the example of the Kyrie situation where Kyrie was complaining after the game and just carrying on like usual. But the foul on Kyrie Irving on Giannis, where Giannis, attempted to take a charge, which, by the way, I think that the percentage chances of Giannis being able to get a charge in that situation was extremely, extremely low. But that doesn't fall into a take foul for me, because he was, regardless of whether it was, he was going to be able to draw that charge, he didn't just wrap a guy up or intentionally foul them. Like, I don't think that falls in that category. I don't really know why Kyrie was upset about it, but I think that plays a little bit different. Before we wrap this up, because we have to do it, standings watch. Now, as we record this Sunday evening, around midnight Central Time, Justin Garcia staying up late for Locked On Bucks, which we absolutely appreciate. We just watched WrestleMania, Stone Cold Stunner in Vince McMahon, taking us back to our childhood. But the Bucks are currently in third right now. They are in a tie with Philadelphia, but we know that the Bucks have the tiebreaker there. But 48-30, the Bucks and Sixers in 3 and 4. Celtics are 49-30, so half a game up. And then Miami's looking pretty comfortable in the 1 seed right now as it currently stands. Perhaps the more interesting aspect is Brooklyn, by virtue of not having really any of the tiebreakers that they need, they're currently in the 10 seed, so obviously they're not falling out of the play-in. In fact, they're locked into the play-in. The Knicks are too far behind there. But there's a real possibility that the Nets will have to play 2 play-in games to get to the 8th seed. Now, of course, that could still change. But as it currently sits, that looks like a relatively realistic scenario, that they're going to have to really battle to get the 8th seed here. We've been talking about the Nets for so many reasons, and I totally agree with what you said earlier in this podcast. I think the game the other night, regardless of if you want to look at it glass half full from a Bucks perspective and say there is a lot more room for improvement, I agree with that. But the reality is that game should have been enough to tell you that is not a series. So anyone that has the idea that it would be an easy series, I heavily dispute that. So I would definitely sign up to see Miami and Brooklyn go at it in the first round. That seems like something I would enjoy watching from a neutral fan perspective. PJ Tucker and Kevin Durant, give me that matchup again. But I guess the other aspect of this, and the Boston-Milwaukee game later in the week could decide, as you pointed to, where the Bucks finish. But it is looking a little more likely that we could be looking at a Chicago, Toronto, Cleveland in the first round. But again, this can change in a couple nights. We'll see what the Bucks do in these 2 games. But it's wild. It's been wild. I can't remember a playoff race quite like this.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be Cleveland, but I think it's going to be Chicago or, well, no, I shouldn't say. Well, no, I do, because I just think the Cavs are running out of gas here, and I don't think the Cavs would get out of the play-in tournament, even if they start to get some guys back.
2 losses. Yeah, I guess that's realistic.
Well, yeah, because realistically, if the season were to end today, I know everything we've said about all of these teams, the same applies here to Atlanta of like, well, Atlanta's defense isn't the greatest, but look at the Cavs offense. And if I'm Cleveland, or any team in that 7 through 10 range, Trae Young isn't a guy that I want to have to face in a 1-game series that determines everything. So I would take the Hawks to beat the Cavs in that 7-8 matchup. Then that means you're playing potentially the Brooklyn Nets for the 8th seed, and they're not beating Brooklyn. So I think this is the end of the line for the Cavaliers. So if you're the Bucks, you hope you get up to second and it's, maybe it's Atlanta. I would be fine with that. Or you finish where you currently are and it's either Chicago or Toronto, hopefully Chicago. But
I don't
that's
want
the
to play
ideal.
Toronto.
I don't either. And I think it's kind of similar. I would expect the Bucks to win in that series, but it's similar to the Nets discussion where it's kind of like basically that series it's the series version of Javon Carter as a player. If James Harden is being defended by Javon Carter, James Harden is going to win that matchup more often than not, but Javon Carter is going to make him go the length of the floor and make it difficult for him. That's what this series is against the Raptors and against the Brooklyn Nets, where maybe you win it in 5 games, but those are going to be 5 highly contested down to the wire games and tough. And it's not what you want going into a second round series. You want to be pressed and challenged a little bit, but it doesn't want to be this feels like a real war out here. And that's what you would have, I think, with the Toronto Raptors. It's really interesting, though. I mean, I did not anticipate it to get to this levels where Brooklyn is currently still 10th. They do not have the tiebreaker to the Charlotte Hornets. So they finish in that 9-10 line, as you mentioned. They can't get to 7. They're only playing for the 8 seed, which would be ideal for the Bucks because I agree. Nobody's taken down the Heat at this point for the 1 seed. But that whole 7 through 10, it's interesting because the Cavs are somewhat comfortable where they have a 2-game advantage in the loss column over the Hornets and the Nets with 4 games or 5 games, I think, left. 3 games left for the Cavs. 2-game advantage in the loss column, 1 game advantage in the loss column over the Hawks, but they don't have the tiebreaker over any of those 3 teams. So if you're Cleveland, it can't come down to a tie situation. The Nets have a really easy schedule. And I've seen a lot of people say, yeah, they're 2 back in the loss column and they don't have the tiebreaker to the Hornets. They have a game yet with the Cavs and they would get the tiebreaker if they win that game. So I kind of feel like the Nets are going to finish either 7th or 8th. And what I would counter with is, yes, the schedule is easy, but even when they've gotten Kevin Durant back and even when they've had Kyrie on the floor, what have you seen from this team that leads you to believe they have that type of stretch where regardless of the schedule, they can win those 4 games and all of a sudden they finish the season in the 7th spot and get that 7th seed in the playoffs. So it's fascinating because usually 1 through 3 like it was last year, if that's what's going to come down to the wire at the very end, and maybe it's 7 and 8 and they'll jockey for position, but it rarely matters. And this year it's like 3 separate groupings where 1 through 4, anything was on the table. And now we're starting to see a little separation from Miami. 7 through 10, same thing. Any of those teams up until last night when Charlotte and Brooklyn were just relegated to the play-in, any of those teams can still finish 7 through 10. And then the Bulls and Raptors are currently tied. So you have 3 separate groups where you have no idea what it could be. You can't even start to project, well, if you fall down to 4, that means you're going to get this team. Or this team has started to separate itself in the 6 line. So if you finish 3rd, you'll get that this is all going to come down to Saturday and Sunday before you have any idea. And, I still, like we said at the top of the podcast, I just feel like you're going to see a Bucks team that plays to win the game on Tuesday against the Bulls. They do the same on Thursday against the Celtics. And that is the game that's going to decide who finishes 2nd or 3rd in the Eastern Conference. The Bucks need that game to avoid the Celtics taking the tiebreaker, and then it would come down to conference record. Right now, they've each lost 18 games in conference. The Celtics have played 2 more games, so that's a really important game on a number of fronts. But after that, the Pistons on Friday is night 2 of a back-to-back. We saw how they treated their last one of those, and this one has even less significance as you head into the final weekend. And then Sunday against the Cavs, I mean, we're probably going to get to a spot where by the time that game tips off, we know the Heat have secured the 1 seed. Depending on what you do with the Celtics on Thursday, you may know you've secured the 2 or the 3 seed, that this is going to be a meaningless game for you, and the Cavs are going to need to win that game to stay out of the 9-10 line or to make sure that they're the 7 seed and have home court in that 7-8 matchup. So I think it comes down to these 2 games, Tuesday and Thursday for the Bucks, and then the rest of it is just, well, enjoy some time off until next Saturday or Sunday when the playoffs begin.
And the league knows what it's doing. They've released the schedule for the final day, which they held off. This came out a couple of hours ago as we're recording this. So the Bucks and Cavs game is actually going to be a 2:30 p.m. Central Time tip. Again, early games, not the favorite of most people, I would suggest. But it's also
2:30 and not noon.
That's true. It's a little bit better for me. But the other games on in the afternoon include Brooklyn, Atlanta, and Charlotte. So the league knows. So the Cavs will be playing. They might not know, but they'll probably know that they're playing for something. So it's that's going to be an exciting way for the regular season to finish anyway. We'll see.
Yeah. The Bucks are in the first wave of games, and it's interesting because all of those teams are all playing at 2:30. The Nets, the Hornets, the Cavs, and the Hawks. So the Celtics play later in the night, the Heat play later in the night, and then the Bulls and I think Raptors both play, or the Bulls just play. The Raptors, I don't think, play that day. Or they do, sorry. So they all play later in the night. So they're taking care of the play-in tournament teams in the 2:30 slots, and then the rest of the conference is 6 o'clock, 7:30, 8:30, kind of staggered.
Well, we'll find out. It's going to be an interesting week nonetheless. Playoffs only a week or so, week and a half away here, which is kind of ridiculous to think about, but it's going to be fun. Big games this week, so stick with us on Locked On Bucks throughout the week for the pre-game stuff, for the post-game stuff. We'll have a bit of fun there. But for Justin and myself, we'll leave it there for Monday. Catch you guys tomorrow.